Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. It's a good time to check in with our monthly panel as the news concerning the economy never stops. Joining us today are the Honourable Joe Oliver, former Canadian Finance and Natural Resources Minister, and of course also the Honourable Gary Marr, former Alberta Minister and now heading up the Canada West Foundation. Welcome to both of you.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
I guess we'll start maybe with you, Joe, and interest rates because they're up in both the United States and in Canada. I guess this is the big question. Take us through it a little bit. Will this successfully strangle inflation or produce a recession or both?
Well, likely both. I think both in the United States and in Canada, the central bankers who came to this conviction somewhat belatedly are talking at least the talk and walking the talk as well. The question is, when are they going to take their foot off the gas? Because people are increasingly concerned that, as you mentioned, higher rates can drive the economy into a recession. I think it's quite likely we will have a recession both in the United States and Canada. The real issue is how deep will it be, and that will depend in part how tough the two central bankers intend to be. I mean, here in Canada, inflation is a little bit less than the United States. I think the last number was 6.9%, and the bank just increased rates by 50 basis points, half a point. In the States, it was 3/4 of a point, and that the number, though, let's say 3.25%, I mean, is still considerably less than the current inflation rate, and a lot less than the targeted inflation rate of 2%, both in Canada and the United States. So there's more work to be done, and the central bankers intend to do it, but there's increasing calls, particularly from the left here, from the NDP, that they should stop. But it's not clear whether they'll have the intestinal fortitude to see this through. But see it through to some degree, they must.
Mm.
Well, and the thing that I would want to add on to that, Tony, is that the challenge is that the government of Canada continues to spend and put more money into the system, and that spending is having a contra effect to the Bank of Canada's tools to try and raise interest rates in order to tame inflation. But if you continue to put more money into the system through government spending, it's going to have a dampening effect on the ability of the Bank of Canada to be able to tame inflation.
Yeah, I agree. I agree
Joe,
completely. Yes. This is a classic situation where a central bank, which is in charge of monetary policy, has to contend with an expansionary fiscal policy, and we're seeing the results of it right now in both Canada and the United States, and it's not going to be pretty.
Also, public sector and other sector wage demands. Clearly, we're seeing this in Ontario with the education workers, that issue coming to a head in the province of Ontario. Will this create a cycle of inflationary pressure, do you think? Joe?
Yeah, I think it's sort of inevitable because, when Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, made a comment that he probably regrets having made, which is to business owners to say, "Hey, look, we're going to deal with inflation, so contain wage increases." Well, the obvious answer from a lot of people was, "Hey, wait a minute. You're okay. You've given raises to your people. Businesses are starting to do better. What about the rest of us who have been hurt badly and simply want to catch up?" And it's perfectly understandable they do, particularly in the private sector, because the public sector has done okay.
We're going to take a brief break from our guests, the Honorable Joe Oliver and the Honorable Gary Marr, obviously talking about the economy, present and future. Lots to discuss. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust and our monthly panel here at the News Forum. We've got the Honorable Gary Marr, who's now head of the Canada West Foundation, and former Finance Minister Joe Oliver. Joe, you've been in this position before, but at the time of taping, we can say that Chrystia Freeland is planning her fall statement. It will come out after this broadcast is taped. But any thoughts about what it'll contain and what direction it'll be going?
Well, what it'll contain and what it should contain may not be the same. But I was encouraged, although a little skeptical, to see that both her boss, the Prime Minister, and Chrystia Freeland herself seem to want to get in touch with their inner Stephen Harper because they're talking about fiscal responsibility. I mean, it's a little like listening to an arsonist pretending that he's Smokey Bear. Given, the fairly profligate track record on the fiscal side of the government, but when liberals hit the wall, they do what they have no choice but to do, and that's what happened to Prime Minister Chrétien and his then Minister of Finance Paul Martin in the 90s, and they had to address the huge debt and the declining credit rating, the calls from the Wall Street Journal that Canada's dollar was like the Mexican peso. So they started to move to fiscal prudence, and it was painful, but they did it. Will this government start to do that? I don't know. There's a glimmer of hope in this, but so we have. She has to confront short-term and long-term problems. In the short term, we've got, as we discussed, increased interest rates, high inflation, and a looming recession. And in the longer term, the critical issue is growth and the poor productivity, capital flight, and prospects really for mediocre growth over the intermediate and longer term. The OECD predicted that our growth rate would be 0.7% for the next 20 years and then 0.8% for the 20 years after that, putting us actually at the bottom of all developed countries. This is very bad, and we've got to do something about it. It can't be entirely through population growth, although I see there's some big numbers apparently coming our way. It's also got to do with productivity, and that means dealing with excess regulation, higher taxes, too much spending, and stop killing the resource industry.
Gary, any thoughts?
Well, I agree with Joe. What should be contained in that report may be different than what's actually contained. Growth is one of the things that I think we should be focused on. I noted yesterday that Minister Fraser announced that we're going to increase the number of immigrants that we bring into Canada. This year, I think it was about 400,000, and he wants to move it to 500,000. I think that's a good thing, but it will have impacts on things like affordable housing in certain parts of the country, example. And so that's something that should be focused on. I hope that there is a greater understanding of the need of natural resources, and the development of same in Canada. I think that productivity is a real problem. I also think that trade infrastructure is a huge issue that needs to be addressed. Countries throughout the world are surveyed with respect to how good their trade infrastructure is. And Canada has dropped from being number 10 in the world in 2011 to being number 32. And so our country is a very trade dependent economy. We rely on exports, and that is positive because that's what helps pay for all the things that we want to have. So we need to focus on infrastructure so that we can do what we have to do in order to pay for what we want to have.
Joe, we've got about 25 seconds before the break. Any comments on what Gary just said?
Yeah, well, in terms of immigration, most Canadians, myself included, are in favor of it. It's always a question of how much. And there is an issue potentially of social cohesion that we've got to be giving some thought to. And also,
hold the also, because we're out of time. We'll take a brief break. Gentlemen, there's a political debate going on in Parliament Hill whether our inflation, or just inflation, as Pierre Poilievre calls it, is homegrown or whether it's part of an international trend. What do you gentlemen think, Joe?
Well, it's clearly both. There is no question that this government has created inflationary pressures. I mean, after all, inflation arises when demand increases and there isn't enough supply. And there was huge demand created by the extraordinary fiscal stimulus of $500 billion that the government created. Money was, if not printed, I mean, digitally created, which is effectively the same thing. Money supply goes up, and so does inflation. So there is no question that fiscal policy in a very significant way contributed to that. Also, our lack of resource development meant that we had to import more highly expensive oil and gas. The other side, of course, the international contribution was fairly significant as well, particularly flowing from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that were imposed on Russia and their retaliatory measures that boosted the price of natural resources. So we're dealing with a double whammy. But a government is there to make problems less harmful and not exacerbate them, and that's unfortunately what's happened here.
Point of view, Gary?
Well, I'd agree. It's clearly both. There are factors that are international, and let me say this: I mean, 3 years ago, nobody knew what a supply chain was. Now everybody's acutely aware of what a supply chain is and how it impacts the cost of goods that we import into Canada. So there are factors from outside, but as Joe points out, there are factors inside that didn't make things any easier either. One would think that Canada, one of the net food exporters, we're a food secure nation. I think we're number 5 or number 6 in terms of net food exports, and yet people see the cost of their groceries going up every day. There's got to be some way of being able to tamp down inflation with domestic tools that are not being used right now. Energy would be another area, I think. And Joe.
Well, I was going to ask you, Gary, on the energy front. Obviously, that's such a global issue right now. Your thoughts on that, gentlemen, would be appreciated.
Well, I mean, Canada, look, we've got depending on who's counting, either the 3rd or 4th largest proven reserves in the world. I would argue that we've got the largest proven reserves that you can audit in the world. And I think that it's important that we develop them in a responsible way. And clearly, when you look at programs like Pathways, which is the major oil sands producers all working together to come to net zero by 2050, industries there, they want to see this happen. They have the tools. Nobody really talks about the costs of doing that, which I think is an important discussion to have. But do we have resources in this country, be it natural gas, be it oil, and how do we use them? Not only for gasoline or diesel, but also for plastics that are used throughout our economy, using them for all kinds of purposes, PPEs as an example. There are all kinds of things that we produce here in this country that with the right public policy, we could produce more of what we need domestically and rely less upon, offshore sources of such goods, onshoring, nearshoring. I know this is something that you're keenly interested in, Tony, but energy is clearly one of the really big areas where Canada, with the right kind of public policy, could be developing these sources of energy in a responsible way that benefits not just Canada, but the world as well.
Yeah, and Joe, I'm going to let you respond to this as well. We are going to take a commercial break first. However, I would just add to Gary's point that it is mystifying to me that we've got so many things to offer the world, whether it's energy, even short term. Even if you want to decarbonize, we can help the world do that, but in a way that is successful, and food as well as all these other products. So it'll be interesting to see whether we step up or not. We're going to take our break. We'll be back with our guests after that. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with the monthly panel, the Honourable Joe Oliver, the Honourable Gary Marr. Joe, we were just talking about supply chain and Canada's ability to be part of the solution. Your thoughts on this?
Well, look, I agree with what Gary said. It's really a national tragedy that we haven't been able to do what we can do, which is responsibly develop our natural resources. It's cost us jobs, economic growth. It's hurt inflation. It's promoted divisiveness regionally, and it's hobbled us in our ability to help our allies at an absolutely critical time. This doesn't have to happen, particularly since what we're doing isn't really helping the environment. If we had an opportunity to sell more of our natural gas, we would help our allies get off coal, which they're increasingly going to right now during the terrible energy crisis Europe is suffering from, and that would reduce net global emissions. So the policies are just totally wrong-headed, expensive, and ineffective.
One thing that was interesting about what Chrystia Freeland had to say when she was in Washington at the Brookings Institute a week or so ago was that she said, our European allies really helped us out when Canada needed vaccine supply. And so in a reciprocal way, when they need to respond. I hope that's not just a lip service to that. I hope that she believes that and that she wants to help accomplish that, because in a very real way, as Joe said, we could be reducing, emissions in Germany where they are recommissioning coal power plants. And we could be supplying them with the gas that they need and the industries that they need, that need natural gas in order to run a whole host of different industries in Germany. So this is Vladimir Putin has weaponized energy, and we need to do our part to help out our allies who have been helpful to us.
Speaking of allies, of course, Canada-U.S. trade relations are critically important, always will be. Of course, we've got the U.S. midterm elections happening on November 8th. Joe Oliver, any predictions how that will impact on Canada and our bilateral relationship?
Well, it looks like there's been a recent surge, a resurge towards the Republicans, and it's highly likely they're going to win in the House of Representatives, and it's starting to look like they just may well win the Senate as well. And this could create some pretty fundamental changes inside the country with implications for Canada. One of the things that we're dealing with right now is President Biden's so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't really reduce inflation, but has put hundreds of millions of dollars in support of green energy projects. And now we're hearing that the Canadian government feels it has to match that proportionately, and so we may see more of that kind of spending in the indicated in the economic statement. So whether a change in the two houses will reverse that could have real implications, for Canada. But we're going to be increasingly lonely in our obsession with achieving net zero. When I'm wondering whether there's any other countries in the world who are, aside from talking about it, are actually doing very much. And the United States may be the next one to fall.
Well, I'm afraid, Gary, you're going to have to add your comment next month because we are officially out of time. I'm sure this will be an ongoing conversation, not to fret. But gentlemen, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Insightful comments from Joe Oliver and Gary Marr there about the future of our economy, interest rates, obviously, recession and cost of living, and then moving on from that to supply chain and our bilateral relationship with the United States. Lots going on. I'm sure this, as I said, will be an ongoing conversation. Thanks for being with us today, however. Thanks for watching.